This is Kennergy. Today we're driving through the Santa Cruz Mountains in search of Bigfoot. I think we may have found him.
Yeah, I had a flashback memory of seeing one as a child.
Cool.
I was a full-grown adult, I believe in my 30s when I had this memory, and for a number of years I kind of pushed it aside, assumed that it was wishful thinking, because my memory was that the event would have happened when I was about 10 years old, and I don't see how I could have forgotten such a thing.
Right.
So why was this memory suppressed? And because it just popped out. I was reading an account in a book. A lady said she was on the Eel River. It was 1950. She saw a Bigfoot, and it had clothing of some sort. And when I read that passage in this book, I suddenly had this flashback of seeing a Bigfoot on the Eel River in 1950 that had what appeared to be a tattered shirt, just kind of hanging off of one shoulder. It wasn't, you know, literally wearing the shirt, but looked like it had attempted to wear it and it didn't fit. But the rest of it, of course, was naked and covered in dark brown hair. I mean, it was obviously much bigger than my parents. I was with them at the time. They were making breakfast on the camp stove. I wandered off, so they didn't realize I'd left camp. And then I'm just standing there looking at this thing in fascination, because I stepped out of the brush onto an open sandbar, and it was just standing there waiting for me. Made eye contact, then my parents started screaming, so I ran back, told them I was all right, because they wondered where their 5-year-old had run off. It turned out I was actually 5 years old when that occurred. I had thought it had happened in 1957. I spoke to my mother recently, within the last 10 years. I spoke to her about it, and she set me straight on that and said, no, those trips took place when you were younger. It was 1950 and 51. So that's how that all went down, and that, of course, that when in 51 they printed a news article about the footprints being found on Mount Everest, I got a scrapbook and I started collecting. Cool. And that's the beginning of this museum as you see it today.
What can you tell me about sightings here in the Santa Cruz Mountains in Lake?
Well, I can tell you that when the reports started coming in, and actually a little prior to that, I had been doing research on the history of the area, because I wanted to tie in our project right here. I wanted to tie us into history in terms of time and space. So my concept was to build a timeline as to how this area got developed, how people first came to be here, when that happened, what happened to the Bigfoot that were here when the people got here, where did they go? Because I was sure that there would be Bigfoot here, because it's a beautiful place to live. And so I am quite sure that along with the grizzly bears that used to live here and the Ohlone Indians, there were also Bigfoot. And they probably got along famously, as they did all over the country. And then the Europeans showed up and started taking over the continent. And in the process of doing that, these things had to go further into hiding. They got along fine with the Indians, who, you know, they were pretty equal to, because the Indians were still operating with Stone Age weapons, essentially. But when gunpowder and all that came into the picture, and we developed these weapons of mass destruction, well, the big guys had to go into hiding.
But
so we found out that they go all the way back to 1870 in this area. Reports of sightings. There's one written up in a San Francisco newspaper. We have the article printed up right there. And they talked about a wild man whose screams kept the campers in Felton up all night long. Now, to this day, people in this area report these outrageous screams in the night, which wake them up out of a sound sleep and put them on edge, because they're just massive in volume, and they don't appear to be any known animal. So I gave up being an amateur Bigfoot hunter 5 years ago, and I've been doing it now full time. And so I was actually quite excited to find out that there were sighting reports in this area, which meant I didn't have to travel other than a few minutes to go to a place where a Bigfoot's been seen. And that's what we've been doing, and doing frequently. I was out last night, for example. The skeptical scientists they usually show on these documentaries, they always grab some scientist Usually he's not necessarily even an anthropologist, just somebody with some letters after their name, and they'll say all the typical reasons why Bigfoot's not real.
Right.
And they'll say, for example, there's no evidence, and you know, it's really sad that they do that, because it's not true. What they should be saying is there's no evidence they're willing to accept yet.
Right.
But there's tons of evidence, and enough evidence to certainly prove Bigfoot in court.
Okay.
You know, I mean, we put people away on eyewitness testimony. We lock them up forever, and in some cases kill them. With the court system based on eyewitness testimony, and scientists will not pay any attention to any of the eyewitnesses, including their own peers. We have scientists now who've seen these things with their own eyes, have experienced them in the wild, and they are forced to do their research covertly for fear of censure by their peers. So I think that makes sense that the more ape-like Yeti would probably be Gigantopithecus, which was a giant ape. And all scientists agree to that. Some scientists think maybe it walked upright, but there's no indication or proof of that yet. Then there's this thing called Meganthropus, which is actually, some scientists say, shouldn't be called that. It shouldn't have a separate name. It should just be considered an extra-large Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus are the ones that started inventing tools and fire and things like that, were pretty intelligent, and started spreading out of Africa and populating the globe. And so they're considered the ancestor that did the biggest mass exodus and spread us around. So it makes sense that the ones that went across the land bridge and got here would likely be those. So there you go. And the skull itself matches the Patterson film better than the Gigantopithecus skull. Here it's compared to a human upper molar, and you can see it's considerably larger. And the problem with the tooth is that the crown of the tooth is worn down to the pulp, so there are no cusps that you can look at on top. And most paleontologists identify teeth by looking at the cusps. So dentists have told us this looks like an extra big human tooth, but they don't know enough about other kinds of teeth. And anthropologists who know about lots of kinds of teeth, they really need to see those cusps on the crown to really make a decision as to what it comes from. So all I get are vague answers so far.
Cool.
But it does match nicely in terms of size and shape the teeth in the jaw of the Meganthropus that we have on display over there. And yet, they want to put down people who study mystery primates, and yet we look at the history of the discovery of new species, and we find it full of examples of indigenous peoples describing animals that the scientists were reticent to accept. They called them myths, they called them hoaxes, you know, everything else. And
until they have one in a jar.
Well, yeah, and then they finally had one on a slab.
Yeah.
Well, the first time they had a duck-billed platypus on a slab, they still couldn't believe their eyes.
Right.
The scientist who had it said, this is the work of a clever Chinese taxidermist. Yeah. So he wasn't even willing to accept a platypus until he had more than one on a slab.
Right.
I'll suggest that that'll happen with the first Bigfoot, too.
Right.
The first Bigfoot will probably be a roadkill, some kind of an accidental death. It'll turn out that it appears to be a feral human, some wild person, and the skeptics will say, well, this is a one-time event. This is just some crazy wild man who went nuts and happened to get run down, and look how he's covered in hair and all this. But it's a human. So there's no Bigfoot. They'll stay. I'll bet you that this is the way it'll go down the first time.
Right. So how is this museum and your work funded?
It's been funded by the equity in my home, and as a matter of fact, interesting you mention that, because come last September, I ran out of funding. My house is now in foreclosure.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
So I'll tell you what, it shows that I have the conviction of my belief system and my research and my citing, and that I know these things are there and that this is important research. And I was willing to take that chance. I'm hoping that some miracle will still pull it out of the fire, but nonetheless, even if the house goes, this will not go, and I will stay dedicated to this pursuit. because I think it's about time that science worked out a little bit of a new methodology. And instead of throwing out all these indigenous stories from indigenous peoples and so forth, they need to work with cultural anthropologists and learn how to work that into the scientific method.
Right.
And instead of just, you know, a priori saying everything that we're told by living human beings is bunk, and we'll only accept things once we have it under a microscope. They need to have a soft line there, and we're on a platform about that. So that's why we were there. He had shown us pictures. He had told us the story. We finally went out there to see. We went up on this hill. We were there for an hour looking around. Then we came back down on the road, which is, once again, it's next to the creek, and then on the other side of the creek is this big orchard. So then we heard the scream. Off in the distance, further up the hill, in Nicene Marks Park, the scream comes out. It's a siren-like scream.
Really?
And then a bunch of dogs all joined in on top
Triggered
of it.
by that. How
But
how
the
long
dogs
was
were
it?
bark, 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 you know, howling, and this thing was just
What was? How long
siren-like
was it?
scream. Oh, a minute and a half.
A minute and a half?
Oh, at least.
Unbroken?
Apparently unbroken. Here's the movie cropped down to just the part where the motion is.
Yeah.
And I'll play it over and over so you can watch it.
Okay.
Now, let me cue it up here. Stop it for a second. The motion takes place right here. So you've got this big tree here in the middle, and then you've got this little cluster of limbs and things, and that white spot. And that's where you need to watch.
Okay.
And so he was
Yeah,
watching
I see the white spot.
just like we're watching it, and he happened to notice. So if I do this slowly, I'll show you what I'm talking about. You see how there's something moving there? Here, it'll be more clear. No, it's more clear further back. Here we go. Right there. You can see something big and dark, and then it goes away. Then I opened those frames up in Photoshop, put them on separate layers. Then I went through and I moved them so that they stopped moving that way, because you got two motions, the motion in the frame and then the whole thing moving. So I went a frame at a time and I tried to line everything up so it stayed in one spot so you could watch it. And then I saved it off as a GIF file. So I'll play you the GIF files.
Okay, thank
I've got
you.
one that's enhanced and one that isn't.
Yeah, let's see the enhanced one.
Here's the first one. It's going to open up in a browser window here. Here we go. So you watch right in there.
Yeah. Clear as a bell. Clear as a bell. How many frames do you think that was?
Oh, it's about 30 frames.
Clear as a bell.
What I have here, no, actually, it's
and
25.
vertical, not a four-legged creature.
Yeah, it looks like it's pretty bulky too.
Well, that was our visit to the Bigfoot Discovery Museum in Felton, California, here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. I'm still quite skeptical about whether Bigfoot actually exists, but that footage they had of the Bigfoot near Nicene Marks Park, that was kind of interesting for fresh local footage of possible Bigfoot sighting. So I'm still skeptical, but maybe right up there, in these mountains, Bigfoot is watching us now.